There is a second face hiding underneath the face of Nefertiti. Not painted on, not cracked into the surface. A complete, finished, fully carved second face sealed inside the most famous portrait in human history. And when researchers slid the bust into a scanner and looked beneath the plaster, the woman staring back at them was not the queen the world knows. She was older. Creases ran from the corners of her mouth. There were lines on her cheeks and a bump on the ridge of her nose. A real face. A human face. And over that face, 3,300 years ago, someone laid down layer after layer of plaster, thicker exactly where the flaws were, until the real woman disappeared and the perfect one took her place. The most famous beauty in human history is an edit. The scan proved it, and the finding was published in a peer-reviewed medical journal, which means every poster, every textbook cover, every photograph ever taken of that bust is showing you the mask. The true portrait of Nefertiti, the only honest one that exists anywhere on Earth, has never been seen by a single living person. It is 2 millimeters under the surface, and it was hidden on purpose, on someone's orders. And the cover-up is not the strangest part of this story. Because the deeper you look into this one object, the worse it gets. There is the eye that was never finished, and the reason it may have been left blind deliberately. There is the museum that held the scan of the hidden face and fought for years to keep the file locked away until it was forced open and found to have something carved into the data itself. And there is the queen herself, who vanished from history in mid-sentence, whose body has never been found, and whose tomb may be sitting behind a painted wall that archaeologists are scanning right now and are not allowed to open. 3 secrets. 1 piece of painted stone. And it starts with the part of this object that every visitor notices in the first 5 seconds and nobody thinks about twice. The left eye is missing. The bust came out of the ground with that socket already empty. December 6th, 1912. A dig site in Middle Egypt called Tel El Amarna, the ruins of a city that existed for barely 15 years before it was abandoned and stripped. A German team, led by the archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt, was clearing a collapsed building when a workman's tool broke through into a small room filled with debris. Objects found inside identified the owner, Tutmosis, chief of works, the royal sculptor. This was not a tomb, it was not a temple, it was a workshop, an artist's studio, buried and forgotten for 3,200 years. And lying in the rubble, face up, was the bust. Today, catalog number M21300 of the Neues Museum in Berlin. With the right eye complete, a rock crystal inlay over a painted iris fixed in place with beeswax, so lifelike that under certain light it seems wet, and the left socket blank. Just smooth, empty surface where the crystal should be. The obvious explanation is damage. The eye fell out at some point in 3 millennia and was lost. That was the mainstream reading for years, and it sounds perfectly reasonable. But that explanation has a problem. When the socket was examined closely, researchers found no convincing trace of the adhesive that should have anchored an inlay. Borchardt himself had his workers sift the debris of the workshop, searching for the missing crystal, and he reportedly offered a cash reward to any workman who found it. Nothing ever turned up. Not in that room. Not in the surrounding rubble. Several specialists concluded the inlay was never installed at all. The bust left the sculptor's hands with one eye deliberately unfinished. Why would the greatest sculptor of his age finish every eyelash of a masterpiece and then stop one eye short of completion? The way the bust was found makes the question sharper. When the city of Amarna died, sometime after the death of the pharaoh Akhenaten, the population left in a hurry. Tutmosis, or whoever emptied his studio, packed up the bronze tools and everything worth carrying. But the plaster models and reference heads stayed behind on their wooden shelves in a locked storeroom, and over the years, the shelving collapsed and the bust tipped forward into a bed of soft debris, face up, which is the only reason the nose and the crown were not smashed. The greatest sculptor in Egypt walked away from his own masterpiece. He did not present it to a temple. He did not sell it. He did not take it with him. He left the face of the most famous queen in the world sitting on a shelf in a back room, as if it were a piece of equipment. That detail bothered scholars from the beginning. And it should bother you, because it is the first hint that this object was never meant to be seen by the public at all. It was a tool. Some argued it was a sculptor's model, a reference head kept so that apprentices could copy the queen's features onto other statues. And the empty socket was a teaching aid, a demonstration of how an eye inlay is seated. Others pointed to something darker. In Egyptian belief, an image was not just a picture. A complete image could serve as a vessel, a functioning double of the person it showed. Leaving it incomplete leaves it inert. A portrait with one blind eye is a portrait that has been switched off. Was the bust unfinished by accident of history, or unfinished on purpose by someone who did not want this particular image of this particular queen to be whole? Keep that question in your pocket, because the second clue makes it much harder to answer innocently. The second clue is the scan, and to understand what it found, you need to know what everyone assumed before it: a limestone core, a thin skin of stucco plaster, paint on top, a beautiful surface, and underneath it, nothing but rock. That assumption held for almost 100 years. The bust had actually been scanned before, back in 1992, with the medical technology of the day. That early machine could only capture cross-sections 5 millimeters apart. Thick slices, coarse detail. It confirmed there was limestone under the plaster and nothing else worth reporting. Case closed, everyone assumed, the same way everyone assumed the pyramids were solid after the first crude scans came back empty. Then, in 2006, the bust was carefully transported to a Berlin hospital, the Charité, and slid into a modern computed tomography scanner under the direction of Dr. Alexander Huppertz, head of the Imaging Science Institute. This time, the machine could resolve detail at the scale of fractions of a millimeter, thousands of virtual slices, reconstructed into a full three-dimensional model of everything inside the stone. The team's hypothesis going in was boring and sensible. The limestone core was probably just a rough support, a blank shape for the stucco artist to build on. That is not what the data showed. The data showed a face under the smooth plaster skin, 1 to 2 millimeters below the surface in places. The limestone core was itself a finished, delicately carved, highly detailed portrait of the queen. A complete second sculpture, hidden inside the first. The 1992 machine had missed it for a simple, brutal reason. Its slices were 5 millimeters thick, and the carving sits barely 1 or 2 millimeters down. The old scan had looked straight through the secret without ever resolving it, the way a blurry photograph looks through a fingerprint. For 14 years, the answer sat in plain sight, one generation of technology out of reach. And here is the part that made headlines in the radiology world when the results were published in the April 2009 issue of the journal Radiology. The two faces are not the same. The inner face has creases running from the corners of the mouth. It has lines on the cheeks. It has a distinct bump on the ridge of the nose. The cheekbones are less dramatic. The eyelids show their age. The inner Nefertiti, the stone Nefertiti, is an older woman, a real woman, a specific human being with an imperfect nose and the beginnings of lines around her mouth. And then, over that real face, layer by layer, someone applied stucco of carefully varying thickness. Thicker here, thinner there. The plaster smoothed the nose. The plaster erased the creases. The plaster sharpened the cheekbones and rebuilt the shoulders. The scan proved that the differences were not random settling of material. The corrections were placed exactly where the corrections were needed. Huppertz put it carefully in interviews. Someone, he suggested, expressly ordered those adjustments. A curator at the British Museum, reviewing the findings, said the natural conclusion was that the final version was judged more acceptable than the hidden one. and that explaining why would probably remain elusive. Sit with what that actually means. The most famous face in the ancient world, the face on the posters and the textbook covers and the museum tickets, the face that defined beauty for a century, is an edit. It is retouching. It is a 3,300-year-old version of airbrushing, executed in plaster instead of pixels. And it was so well done that it fooled every expert who ever studied the bust, until a hospital scanner caught it. The scan revealed other things too. It mapped hairline fissures inside the shoulders and the crown, weak zones invisible from outside, places where the stucco is barely bonded to the stone, and a single hard vibration could shear it loose. It showed the ears and the rear of the crown built up in the most fragile way of all, thick plaster over thin support. The researchers said openly that this internal map would now dictate how the bust could ever be handled, moved, or displayed again. In other words, the scan did two things at once. It exposed the Queen's secret, and it handed the museum a scientific reason to never let her leave. Remember that, because it comes back later in the story in a way nobody expected. But the core finding was the face itself. The true portrait, the one taken from life with the bump in the lines and the age, was sealed underneath and shown to no one. Thutmose did not destroy the real face. That is the strange part. He carved it in full, in loving detail, and then buried it under an idealized mask, as if the truth had to exist but could never be allowed to show. They weren't guessing at her appearance. They recorded it, and then they covered it up. Now, an ordinary story would stop there. A fascinating insight into royal image management. A nice paragraph for the guidebooks. But this story does not stop there, because of what happened when people tried to look at that scan data. And that is the third clue. It is not carved in limestone. It is carved into a computer file. And it was carved in the 21st century. After the CT work, and after further high-precision surface scanning, the museum possessed something remarkable. A complete, exact, three-dimensional digital record of the bust, accurate to fractions of a millimeter, including data on the hidden face. In an age when museums were racing to put their collections online, you might expect that model to be published for the world. It was not. It was locked away. Researchers asked for it. Artists asked for it. The answer was no, year after year. Then, in 2016, two artists announced they had done something audacious. They claimed to have walked into the Noise Museum with a concealed scanner and secretly captured the bust themselves, releasing the data to the public as an act of protest they called the Nefertiti hack. The file spread across the world. People printed copies. One printed copy was even placed in Egypt as a symbolic return. But when specialists examined the released data, they noticed something odd. It was too good. Far too detailed for a hidden device waved around a glass case in a crowded gallery. The most credible explanation, argued publicly by people who analyze 3D scans for a living, is that the file was not a guerrilla scan at all. It was the museum's own official scan, leaked from the inside. Which meant the perfect digital copy existed all along, exactly as suspected, and the institution holding it had simply decided the public could not have it. An American artist and open access advocate named Cosmo Wenman decided to test that decision. He filed a Freedom of Information application in Germany, demanding the release of the official scan. The process dragged on for 3 years. The museum's foundation resisted, and one of the arguments reportedly raised was revealing. Releasing the data, they suggested, could threaten commercial interests. The gift shop replicas, the licensed copies. A public institution holding a scan of a 4,000-year-old queen, it acquired under disputed circumstances from another country, arguing that the data had to stay secret, partly because of retail. In 2019, they finally gave in and released the file. And when Wenman opened it and examined the underside of the digital model, he found something that tells you everything about how tightly this object is controlled. Carved into the virtual stone of the base, in the data itself, the museum had engraved a copyright claim. They had inscribed ownership, directly onto the digital body of Nefertiti, like a brand. A queen who has been dead for 33 centuries, claimed line by line in a 3D file. It was sealed, it was scanned, and even the scan was sealed. And that pattern, control, restriction, refusal, runs through this object's entire modern history, and it started the moment it left the ground. Borchart's diary entry from the day of discovery is famous among Egyptologists. He wrote that describing it with words was useless. It had to be seen. What is less famous is what he did next. Under the rules of the time, fines were divided between Egypt and the foreign excavators, a system called partage. When the division happened in January 1913, the bust went to the German side, and how exactly that happened has been argued about ever since. Documents and later accounts suggest the bust was listed in a way that undersold it, described in the paperwork as gypsum, plaster, rather than painted limestone, and represented by a photograph that did not show it at its best. Whether that was deception or sloppiness, the result was the same. The single greatest artwork ever pulled out of Egyptian soil left the country in a crate, and Germany did not even display it publicly until 1924. When it finally went on show in Berlin, it caused a sensation, and Egypt immediately demanded its return. The demands have never stopped. The answer has never changed. The dispute grew so bitter that Egypt suspended German excavation permits. In 1933, a deal was actually on the table to return her. It reached the very top of the German government, and the very top killed it. Adolf Hitler had seen the bust, and he declared, in words that survive in the diplomatic record, that he would never relinquish the head of the queen. He planned to build a new museum in his remade Berlin, with Nefertiti enthroned at its center. During the war, she was hidden in a salt mine. After the war, she became a pawn between East and West Germany, both claiming her. And in 2007, when Egypt's antiquities chief asked simply to borrow her for the opening of a new museum in Cairo, a loan, not a return, Berlin refused, ruling that the bust was too fragile to travel. And here is where that CT scan came back around. The same imaging that exposed the hidden face also mapped those internal fissures, and the museum pointed to exactly that data as scientific proof she could never be moved. The scan that revealed the queen's secret became the lock on her cage, too fragile to fly to Egypt in a climate-controlled case, yet stable enough to be trucked across Berlin to a hospital and rotated through a scanner. Every request refused. Every door closed. You do not guard an object this obsessively unless you understand exactly how much it is worth, and exactly how weak your claim to it might be. Now, this is the point where an honest investigation has to slow down and ask the hard question: does any of this prove a grand conspiracy? Some researchers have gone very far with this object. In 2009, a Swiss art historian named Henri Stierlin published a book claiming the bust is not ancient at all. That Borchardt had it manufactured in 1912 as a test piece for ancient pigments, and then stayed silent when a Prussian prince admired it as an original. It is a seductive theory. It would explain the missing eye and the perfect condition. But that explanation has a problem, and the problem is the scan itself. The 2006 CT data shows an internal structure no forger would ever create. A fully carved, anatomically subtle, aged inner face, hidden where no human eye could ever appreciate it, built up with stucco layers whose composition matches genuine Amarna period material, showing long-term wear, historic repairs, and stress patterns consistent with enormous age. A faker in 1912 would have had no scanner, no reason, and no ability to sculpt a masterpiece, and then bury it under plaster purely to fool a machine that would not exist for another century. The director of Berlin's Egyptian Museum dismissed the forgery claim flatly, citing the radiological tests and material analysis, and on this point, the evidence is with him. The hidden face is not evidence of a modern hoax. It is the strongest proof of authenticity the bust has. So no, this does not prove the bust is fake, and it does not prove aliens or lost technology, and I am not going to pretend it does. The grounded explanation is that we are looking at the working method of a master sculptor and the image policy of a royal court. The bust was almost certainly a master model, the studio's official reference, the approved template from which every other image of the queen across the empire was to be copied. That is why it sat in a workshop instead of a temple. And it may even be why the second eye was never set. A template does not need to see. But be honest about what that grounded explanation still contains, because it is stranger than the myth. It means that in the 14th century BC, at the court of the pharaoh Akhenaten, there existed something we thought was modern: systematic, deliberate, politically directed image manipulation. A real face was recorded with clinical accuracy, then overwritten with an approved version, on the orders of someone with the power to decide what the queen was allowed to look like. And that approved version was then mass-produced, statue after statue, relief after relief, across an entire kingdom, while the original stayed locked in a back room. Propaganda is not new. Photoshop is not new. We just found the Bronze Age version, and it was hiding inside the one object everyone in the world thought they knew. And that raises the final question, the one that turns this from an art story into a mystery that is still open. Why did the real face need to disappear? Because here is the thing about Nefertiti. It is not only her true face that vanished. She vanished. This woman was not decoration. She ruled beside Akhenaten as he tore down Egypt's entire religious order, shut the old temples, stripped the powerful priesthood of Amun of its wealth, and forced the worship of a single god, the sun disk, the Aten. It was the most radical religious revolution in the ancient world, and she stood at the center of it. She appears in carvings, doing things no queen was shown doing, smiting enemies in the classic pose reserved for kings, driving her own chariot, officiating in rituals as an equal. On some monuments, her image appears more often than the pharaoh's. Some scholars believe she rose even higher, that she is the mysterious co-ruler who appears in the records under a new name near the end of the reign, possibly ruling as Pharaoh herself after her husband's death, the last hand steering a collapsing revolution. And then, around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, her name simply stops. No death record, no burial account, no body that anyone has confirmed. The most powerful woman of her age walks out of history in mid-sentence. Her city was abandoned within years. The regimes that followed declared her husband a heretic, smashed his statues, and chiseled the family's names off the monuments, trying to delete the entire episode from the record. They very nearly succeeded. For 3,000 years, until Amarna was dug out of the sand, the world did not even know she had existed. Her tomb has never been found. Or maybe it has, and we have been standing inside it. In 2015, the Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves published a theory that electrified the field. Studying ultra-high-resolution scans of the tomb of Tutankhamun, Nefertiti's probable stepson, he spotted what looked like the traces of sealed doorways hidden under the painted plaster of the north wall. Faint, straight lines. Ghosts of a filled opening running exactly where a continuing corridor should be. His conclusion was that Tutankhamun, who died young and unexpectedly at about 19, was buried in a hurry in the outer section of someone else's tomb, which would finally explain why the most famous tomb in Egypt is so strangely small for a king, barely more than a converted antechamber. The original owner, Reeves argued, still lies behind that wall. His candidate was Nefertiti. The first radar survey, conducted by a Japanese specialist, seemed to back him spectacularly, reporting with high confidence the presence of hidden voids and possibly organic material beyond the wall. Headlines around the world announced that Nefertiti might be days from discovery. Then a second survey, run with different equipment, found nothing at all. A third, larger effort was mounted to break the tie, and it concluded there was no hidden chamber, and the story was declared dead. Except it did not stay dead. In 2020, ground-penetrating radar work reported the possible signature of a corridor-like space, several meters long, a few meters beyond the burial chamber, at the same depth as the tomb. Scan against scan, team against team, and the wall itself has never been opened, because opening it wrongly would destroy one of the most precious painted surfaces on Earth. And if the theory is wrong, you have vandalized Tutankhamun's tomb for nothing. So, the question of where Nefertiti's body lies is, right now, exactly where the question of her true face was in 2005. Sealed behind a thin layer of plaster, waiting for an instrument sensitive enough and a permission slip brave enough to look. That is the full picture. And notice how it rhymes. A face hidden under millimeters of stucco for 100 years of study. A scan file hidden in a drawer for a decade of requests. A burial possibly hidden behind a painted wall that no one is allowed to breach. At every single layer of this story, from the stone to the data to the tomb, someone decided the truth should stay covered. And at every layer, it almost worked. Tonight, the bust is where it has been for a century, in a domed room in the newest museum in Berlin, room 2.10, alone under glass, lit like a relic, photographed by 1 million visitors a year. Every one of those photographs captures the mask. The real Nefertiti, the woman with the lined mouth and the imperfect nose, the only honest portrait of her that exists anywhere on Earth, is still in that room too. She is 2 millimeters away from every camera pointed at her, sealed in the dark under the plaster, exactly where a sculptor hid her 3,300 years ago. Still covered, still silent, still waiting for someone to decide the world is allowed to see her. If buried history like this is your thing, watch the next investigation on screen right now, because what they found under the next monument makes a hidden face look like a warm-up.